am Hope Alwine. I am a digital accessibility specialist here at Accessible Web, and today we are going to be covering Structured for Success, navigating tables, layout tables, and ARIA grids. So before we get started, I do want to add kind of a disclaimer. This is a broad overview of the types of data representation or other forms of tables like layout tables, but this isn't a deep dive into the properties relating to grids and tables, so we aren't going to be going over a lot of the minutia that are related to ARIA and whatnot relating to tables and grids. We are going to cover tables, layout tables, and grids, kind of defining them as well as what we look for when we are auditing them and some good practices. And then we're going to wrap it up of a few questions of what to ask when designing your component and your example and a few examples. So let's get started. So let's talk tables, where the best place to begin is always, what is it? So a table is a static structure that has rows and columns that shows relationships between data in a row to the column or vice versa. We do have an example of a table on the slide, and let's look at some of the parts. First, we've got a caption, which has a brief description of what is in the table, reading students currently enrolled in WAI ARIA 101. This is an example from the ARIA Authoring Practice Guide, Design Pattern for Tables. And the next part we're going to look at is the table header, which has white text in a bold with a teal background that is different from the rest of the table. That kind of visually indicates this is the column header row. It is also coded different as within the table header tags. Next, we have the column, which I have highlighted in a green, not green, a navy outline. The last column on the right titled favorite number. And lastly, I have a row outlined with a dotted line that shows a single row representing Nancy Jensen from Eagle Incorporated at 2203 Logan Drive and has a favorite number of 3.5 because who wants to use a whole number? All right, and let's look at a deeper look at what to expect from tables on the next slide. So what do we look for when we're evaluating a table for accessibility? So first thing, tables must be within the native HTML table elements or defined using ARIA roles and instead of using native. Just a reminder, we do at Accessible Web, we prefer or we recommend that you use native elements rather than ARIA. It's just it communicates easier with assistive technology. So back to tables. Tables usually contain a header with defining tags as well as the table body and an optional table footer. So tables can also have a caption that briefly describes the table's contents. For example, on this slide, we have a screenshot of our page table from one of our Accessible Web demo sites. We could give it a caption of the pages for Shroot Farm. You'll also notice that in this example, we have links in the path column and check boxes for selecting a row. Inherently, tables are not interactive, but interactive elements can be added. If a user is navigating on this page, they'll be able to move focus from the checkbox and the link on each row with the tab key. Now, if the user is using assistive technology, they will have more keyboard options like being able to navigate within the table with arrow keys to be able to read out each cell. For example, assistive technology will read path column 2/bed breakfast link for the second column and third row in the table body. At the beginning of announcing the table, the user will be informed as to how many rows and columns are present to give the user an idea of how big the table is. Lastly, while navigating with keyboard alone, the tab sequence is dictated by the number of interactive components within the table. For example, in the table on the slide, the only way to move within the table without assistive technology is using that tab button or key. So visible focus shows up on the checkbox and checkbox and checks. I cannot speak today. Checkbox. There we go. And the links, but doesn't go into the violation status code and last scan columns directly. We'll touch more on this with grids, but let's move on to our next type, which is layout tables. So what exactly is a layout table? A layout table doesn't represent a relationship between rows and columns. It is strictly used to organize content as seen in the image below. Okay, so we have the final output is a picture of a basement toilet text in the upper left corner with a toilet in the middle of the image and a text that reads must flush up. And it reads from the bottom row to the top row. So looking at the final output, it makes sense. But if you're looking at it in the layout table breakdown, it can get a little jumbled, especially if you're using assistive technology. So assistive technology would read it from the top to the bottom, left to right. So it would sound like basement, up, toilets, flush, and must. So there's quite a difference as we can see. And let's move on to the next slide so we can get a bit more in detail. So what layout tables are like the hairspray infused styles of the 80s and 90s. It seemed like a good idea at the time, given the latest media of the day. We all used it to create those poofy hairstyles that we look back now and ask ourselves, we thought this was cool? Layout tables are kind of the same concept. When web design was in its infancy, layout tables were a great way to create clean web pages. I am guilty, I use them quite a bit. Today, there are more alternatives to layout structure like frameworks such as Bootstrap, CSS grid layouts. There's also quite a few of drag and drop web authoring softwares where you don't have to do any coding and more. While layout tables are not obsolete, their use from an accessibility standpoint is questionable. Why is this? Layout tables in assistive technology are not happy playmates. Assistive technology sees a table and assumes it's going to have a header. It's also going to have a body and possibly a footer. And then when it doesn't find any, it creates a barrier. So layout tables are difficult to customize. Also, layout tables are difficult to customize for users, such as if they resize the text, it can shift the reading order and just create a mess. Turning off CSS can also turn an entire layout table into something that looks like it came from Roswell. So this is something to consider if you are looking at possibly using a layout table. Another key point to remember is that if you are going to use a layout table, ensure that the role of presentation is present within the table tags. That is something that we test for when we're doing manual audits. This tells assistive technology to not look at for typical identifiers and just to kind of ignore the table elements. They're there, but not something to dwell on. So let's move to our last topic for this webinar, which is going to be grids. All right, so what is a grid? Grids are interactive widgets that have a tabular structure. There are two categories of grids. There's data grids and layout grids. So data grids are interactive widgets that contain relationships between rows and columns, just like tables, and are coded as tables, but with the role of grid added. Grids are designed to be more customizable and more interactive, such as the example on the slide, which is a sortable data grid with interactive cells. It's a screenshot of our manual audit grid, which acts as a heat map for manual audit results. You can click on the yellow squares to open up a slide out widget that gives information on that particular success criteria and what failures were flagged for this particular audit. You can also see that there's a play button within the WCAG success criteria column, which links to our manual audit Monday series, which briefly explains each success criteria. And you can definitely see that it is something that is very interactive. There's a lot of different things that you can do within this. There's also the three dots, which opens the submenus. And this is a great example of where a grid comes, the grid design pattern works perfectly. Another grid type is the layout grid, which is another interactive widget, but it doesn't contain any of the typical table elements like multiple rows, as seen in the example of the layout grid. It's pulled from the same ARIA authoring practice guide for layout grids. This is a group of links within a single row. So it doesn't really have any definitions to the columns. They just happen to be there. So let's now move into what to expect when you're auditing grids. So data grids have the same defining marks as a table, including headers that define columns and rows. It also should have the same defining orientation marks on how many rows and how many columns are present for assistive technology. Another big difference between grids and tables is the ability to receive focus within a grid cell. So I've seen grids with column headers that have multiple focusable elements, such as the ability to sort the column. You can add filters, you can have submenus that open other submenus to get more filters and more. The sky's the limit when it comes to data grids. Grids are designed to allow each cell to receive focus, but you do need to be concerned with the focusability for each component within that cell. Another big difference about grids versus tables is the keyboard interaction. So keyboard interactions for grids is inherently, it opens up so much more because you are not limited to just the tab stop sequence. You have the ability to navigate with arrow keys. You can also use the home and end keys, page up and down, as well as being able to select multiple cells and possibly either edit directly within that cell, or you can copy and paste and do whatever you need to do. So test out your options and ensure that any customizable keyboard interactions are communicated. For example, I've seen where you can move the column order within a data grid, and you can literally pick up a column and move it with using the shift and then move it over with the arrow keys. And that's definitely something that if it is unique to your data grid, make sure that that is communicated. So another notable part of layout grids is that there isn't a requirement for the role of presentation to be included. While that is true, there is a very good point to make sure to check that all of your ARIA properties, states, and tab index are properly assigned. That way you are able to use assistive technology without getting bungled with a lot of different elements. That wraps up our overview of tables, layout tables, and grids. Let's look at some questions to consider and examples for situations for each type. So when you're designing your component, I want you to think about a couple of questions while you're deciding which one may be the best for whatever you need to code. So are you showing a relationship between types of data? If so, table would be a good option. If how will a layout table translate when text is resized or CSS is disabled? Can another method retain the reading order? So if you remember back to our layout, that example of the toilet and how it sounded if assistive technology was reading it. So that's definitely something to consider. Also, what kind of keyboard interactions do you want? Do you want something that users can do a lot within a single grid, or do you just want this to just be static information that, is read out? Another thing is to definitely test with assistive technology. That way you know what your users are hearing, as well as making sure that the same information is given to everybody. And lastly, let's look at some examples very quickly. So let's say you need to post a list of contest winners with their names, their hometown, and scores. What would be the best option? I would definitely go with just a regular static table for this one because it sounds like there's not a lot of interactivity. You just need to have that data right there. Next, if I have a complex table with the ability to add or subtract columns, I need filters and sorting capabilities, what would I use? That is a great example of using a data grid because you have so many more options to being able to make that an interactive component within your website. All right, let's say if you have a group of badges that are a link, what would be the best option? You could use a layout grid because if those badges are links, that is definitely an interactive component. But at the same time, you could also use a layout table. So it you just have to think about things like the reading order as well as what is being communicated to assistive technology. All right, well, that wraps it up for me. And let's go to our next slide, which is how can accessible web help? Well, when it comes to tables and grids and whatnot, that is a part of our manual audit process. So that is something to consider. But we also have our automated scanner will pick up some of the semantic information for that and identify if your table is not necessarily coded correctly. But we also do consulting and training as well as our VPATs. And hopefully Ben will come back and take over at this point.
I'm here. Thank you
Okay.
very much, Hope.
All right. And that
Awesome.
wraps it up for us. And we are heading into our Q&A.